This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not to be considered medical advice for any particular patient. Clinicians must rely on their own informed clinical judgments when making recommendations for their patients. Patients in need of medical advice should consult their personal healthcare provider. From UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, welcome to That's Pediatrics. I'm Carolyn Coyne. I'm a scientist in the Division of Pediatric Infectious Diseases.
And I'm Brian Martin. I'm Vice President of Medical Affairs here at Children's.
Joining us today is Linda McAllister-Lucas. Dr. McAllister is the Chief of the Division of Pediatric Hematology Oncology and a Professor of Pediatrics here in the Children's Hospital. And her research really encompasses a vast array of topics related to cancer, the development of cancer, and inflammation in cancer. So thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So I always like to start these kind of the same, but I like to start with sort of just asking you a little bit of background about, just what brought you here to Children's, even to your specialty, as well as to research, just a little bit of background about you.
Well, I guess I'll start by how I ended up in this type of job, and then I'll tell you how I ended up in this type of job at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Yeah. So my interest in this area really started in high school because I had an outstanding chemistry teacher who was amazing, and I became a little bit obsessed with chemistry. And so then when I went to college, I still loved chemistry and science, and I was kind of grappling with what to do with that. And I couldn't decide if I should go to medical school or to graduate school. And then I found out that you can actually do both. And you can do this thing called a MD PhD program where you can do a PhD in biochemistry and also go to medical school, kind of overlapping over the course of many years. And so that is what I decided to do. Went to Vanderbilt for that. And then after Vanderbilt, I decided to go into pediatrics because I loved taking care of children, and I also loved the science behind the pediatric diseases. So I went to University of Michigan for pediatric residency. And during residency, I found out that the diseases that I found the most interesting and the patients that I enjoyed caring for the most were patients undergoing treatment for cancer. And so I decided to pursue a specialty in that area, a fellowship in pediatric hematology oncology. That was a 3-year thing. And then after that, I joined the faculty at University of Michigan. And at Michigan, I did a combination of running a laboratory that studied cancer biology and taking care of patients with leukemia and lymphoma. And then one day I got an email from the department chair from the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh Department of Pediatrics asking me would I consider looking at a job here. I honestly didn't know that much about Pittsburgh or Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, but when I got here, I was so impressed and overwhelmed, and one thing led to another, and I decided to move to Pittsburgh to join this department, and it was an awesome decision. This was in December of 2012, so it's almost been 7 years, and it's been a completely wonderful experience.
Rewinding back a little bit to when you were pursuing your PhD, we have a really interesting list of some of your research efforts here, and as Carolyn alluded to, some of which are directly related to cancer, some of which have sort of other tangents, including hypertension and obesity-dependent insulin resistance. Going back to your PhD days, how did that work sort of inform your trajectory on some of your scientific discoveries to this day?
So when I was a graduate student at Vanderbilt, I did my PhD in a department called molecular physiology, and I worked with this amazing mentor called Jackie Corbin. And Jackie Corbin had discovered what is now a very famous molecule called phosphodiesterase 5. There's a family of these enzymes that are in all types of cells in our body, and this one is particularly famous because it's blocked by a drug called sildenafil. And so I got to see what it was like to study a protein from the perspective of a scientist and then see how those studies led to the development of a new drug. And that was really inspiring to me because it was a direct correlation. My PhD advisor's work and my own work led to the discovery of this drug. It was so rewarding to see. And then when I was taking care of patients during residency, I realized that same thing was happening in cancer. And the kind of discoveries of new drugs in cancer at the time were just so fascinating that it really drove me to pursue cancer biology. And then when we started our own lab at University of Michigan, I realized there's a lot of relationship between the abnormal things that can happen in a cell that cause cancer to the same things that happen in a lot of other diseases, including some of the other diseases you just mentioned when you were describing our research. So, I mean, to summarize, we have realized that there's a great overlap between inflammation in the body and the development of cancer. And that interest all started because I recognized how studying proteins in a cell can lead to the discovery of new treatments for diseases.
And so what are some of the unique challenges of dealing with a pediatric population with cancer? Even in terms of things like inflammation, are there specific challenges with respect to even the development of new drugs or how you would target new cancer therapeutics, let's say, in a pediatric population versus to sort of an older adult population?
That's a great question. Those of us who are scientists in pediatric cancer, one of the things that we struggle with is that the number of patients we have is so much fewer than in adult cancer, which is a great thing, right? Mm-hmm. And yet it also causes challenges in trying to, first of all, do clinical studies because you have limited patients to study. So it's hard to reach conclusions very quickly when there's so few patients to study. And then secondly, pharmaceutical industries are not always as excited about funding pediatric cancer research as they are adult cancer research because there's so few patients. So the amount of resources and information and the speed with which you can make discoveries is slower in children than in adults.
I'd like to switch gears for a moment and ask you a little bit about mentorship and how your experience here at UPMC Children's and how the development of your growth of your lab. And tell me a little bit about the pipeline of young scientists that you have worked with and maybe how that's influenced your career and where you see, like, I think I used the word already, trajectory going here in Pittsburgh.
Well, I'm glad you asked me about mentorship. It's one of my favorite topics. I was super fortunate that I had great mentorship as a PhD student. I had great mentorship as a fellow in pediatric hematology oncology and great mentorship as a junior faculty back at University of Michigan. And so when I came here to Pittsburgh to become the chief of the division, one of the things I really wanted to make sure I did a great job at was to mentor the people younger than me in our division. And so our division, I feel a great deal of responsibility for mentoring our fellows and our junior faculty. So we have a fellowship program where we have 6 fellows at a time, and about half of those people choose to do clinical trial type research in blood disorders and cancer, and about half of them choose to do laboratory research. And then we have a number of junior faculty, and one of the sources of pride of our division is that we have created a pipeline of junior people who are in various stages of training in all of those areas. And I think, basically to be a good mentor, you have to really care what happens to that person, invest a lot of time with them, and guide them through each of the steps in their career.
And what do you think are the unique challenges? I'm a PhD, and so my life has always been spent, and my training has always been spent in the lab, right, in front of a very messy lab bench. So what are some of the challenges, obviously, in mentoring, physician scientists, particularly in the field of hematology, oncology, with respect to kind of juggling, let's say, basic research, and then, of course, all the clinical responsibilities, which are very unique challenges versus maybe those of us that just stand at our, lab benches.
Yeah, I think there are unique challenges because I think the clinical work is so engaging. It's not really possible to do it in like shifts, right? So when you have a patient who has cancer or a blood disorder, you want to give it your all. You want to be totally dedicated. And those people don't need you. They don't get sick according to your schedule based on your research needs. And so you have to be available to people all the time, and you want to do such a good job for them. At the same time, in order to do research, you have to devote significant amount of time and energy to your research. And so balancing those things is really hard. I sometimes imagine, I don't know, it might be easier to balance clinical work and research in a field where you can do shifts, but that is not how it is in pediatric hematology oncology. I think the other challenge is funding. So the great thing going on right now is that there's so much energy, both in blood disorders like sickle cell disease and also in pediatric cancers, in terms of the number of people who are doing research, the number of new discoveries. There's so much change, so much advancement, so many people are excited about it. So there's a big number of people interested. That poses some challenges because the competition for grant money is huge. And so the amount of funding available is limiting. And so trying to carve out the time to think of great ideas, to write grants, and take great care of your patients all at the same time is pretty challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as an existential threat to what used to be called the triple threat model in hematology or in any sort of discipline for that matter? Like, in other words, I guess with bottom line, like, how well are you and your group or pediatric heme onc in general kind of balancing that?
Yeah, I do think this is an existential threat. The threat is sort of coming at our young people trying to carve out careers in research in two ways. They feel pressure to spend a lot of time taking care of patients, and then they also watch how difficult it is for people to obtain funding. And I think the threat is some people will find that so overwhelming that they will make a choice not to pursue research because it's just so difficult.
Well, where do you see the field, moving? So, we hear a lot about advancements even in things like, cancer immunotherapy and things like that. And where do you see at least the field, particularly of pediatric cancers and treatments and therapies moving?
Mm-hmm. So I think there are, for pediatric cancers, I think there's two huge areas that we are moving into in terms of new treatments. And that is in targeted therapies and in immunotherapy. So what does that mean? It means that rather than just calling a patient's diagnosis leukemia, we now have 100 different categories of leukemia. And each patient undergoes such deep and nuanced analysis. So we have so much information about the genetic and biological basis of their disease that we can customize treatment more and more every year. And so I think there's a lot of interest in identifying custom, which is another word for saying targeted treatments for specific cancers, rather than just giving the same group of chemotherapy drugs to patients over and over. So things are much more customized. And then in terms of immunotherapy, it's interesting that some of the immunotherapies that have been used in adults, there's a category of drug called checkpoint inhibitors, haven't had the same degree of momentum and success in pediatrics. And my guess is it's not because they don't work, it's because we don't know how to use them yet in pediatrics. And I think there's a lot of interest in trying to take what we've learned in adult oncology about how to apply immunotherapy and then apply it to tumors that have a very different biology, the childhood tumors, and a very different host, which is usually like a very healthy child. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to think about it in a different way rather than just do exactly what has been done in adult oncology. And in addition to the checkpoint inhibitor drugs, which have received a lot of press, there's also cellular-based therapy like CAR T therapies, which actually have had the most success in children. And they've had the most success in leukemia. And now I think we need to learn how to use that same approach for some of the other cancers. And there's a lot of people out there studying this question.
Linda, can you speak a little bit about, for the listeners, the role of the Children's Oncology Group and the role that Children's Hospital here in Pittsburgh plays nationally as part of a consortium of clinicians and scientists and individuals that are dedicating their lives to improving the experience and outcomes for children with cancer?
So Children's here in Pittsburgh, like almost every pediatric oncology group in the country, believes in the role of the Children's Oncology Group. This is a multi-institution national clinical trials consortium that is run and funded through the NIH. And by running clinical trials in a multi-institutional way across the nation, we make progress so much faster. Because if nobody could do the kind of trials that have been done as a single institution, because no single institution has enough patients to study in a rapid enough manner. So we all believe in the role of the Children's Oncology Group, which we abbreviate as COG. Here at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, I think we do an outstanding job of making sure all of our patients are enrolled in these national studies. And we are super proud that we are one of a select group of organizations who run the phase 1 trials, which are the more experimental drugs. That's a big contribution that we make. In addition to that, we contribute to other consortiums like the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium. That's another consortium that's very important to helping us solve pediatric brain tumors. And then beyond organizations like COG, it's also important that we continue to do individualized scientific investigation that we do here at Children's. And so we think it's important that we continue to be leaders in clinical research and also in laboratory research so that the two areas of research can communicate with each other. We can learn something from studying our patients, and then we can actually take that information and learn and take the information to inform our laboratory experiments, and then vice versa, what we learn in the lab, apply it to new ideas for treatment of patients.
So just to sort of take the research a little bit further, you mentioned, of course, the work that you did as a PhD student. So what is the current research going on in your lab? And again, how does your clinical maybe work experience sort of, have you seen your research kind of change and evolve over the years to sort of follow that clinical side?
So our lab in particular has had a long history of studying a set of oncoproteins that have this name, Karma BCL10-MALT1. And it's abbreviated as the CBM complex. It's a complex of proteins that sit inside a cell, and they're primarily studied in T cells and B cells, part of our immune system. And we all need these proteins in our T cells and B cells, and there are patients who have deficiencies in these proteins, and if you have a deficiency in these proteins, your immune system doesn't work well. And sometimes that's life-threatening and actually requires like a bone marrow transplant in order to cure the patient. On the other hand, sometimes there are mutations in the genes encoding these proteins that causes them to have abnormally persistent activity. And if that happens, that makes the T cell or the B cell proliferate in a way that is not normal and basically causes cancer of the lymphocytes, which is known as lymphoma. And so we've been studying one of these proteins, MALT1, for a long time. And one of the exciting new discoveries that we've made in the last couple of years is we've discovered a new inhibitor of MALT1 in the cell. And so this new inhibitor, when it binds to MALT1, it stops it. And we think it might be a clue to a new idea for a new line of drugs designed to stop cancers that are caused by MALT1.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Linda.
You
we
are
learned
welcome.
a lot.
Really appreciate your time, Linda. Thank you very much.
You are most welcome. Thank you.
You can find other episodes of That's Pediatrics on iTunes, Google Play Music, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new content. Leave a review and tell us what other topics you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening.